Yeah, so this is web components through the eyes of a newcomer. I am that newcomer. As I mentioned before we started recording, there's also this bit.ly link down at the bottom, bit.ly/wc-fldc that has slides and resources and code sandboxes that we'll be looking at. So feel free to take a peek. And also definitely, if you were at the initial session, you heard about this as well, but it's very important that we all abide by the code of conduct. If you haven't taken a look, follow this link and check it out. But in general, let's just all be good to each other and respectful, even outside of this camp as well. So my name is Brian Perry. I am a front-end architect at a company called Bounteous. I live in the Chicago suburbs, but grew up on the East Coast. And I'm a lover of all things components. So building with components in Drupal, style guides and design systems, tools like Pattern Lab and Storybook, and then increasingly building with component-based JavaScript frameworks like React. And then also obviously very relevant to what we'll be talking about today, web components. And I'm also a lover of all things Nintendo. So happy to talk about the cool games you're playing on your Switch. Currently for me, it's Hades, and then the Bowser's Fury portion of Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury. On Twitter at BryComedy, and then also recently launched a new personal website, brianperry.dev, hoping to write there a little bit more frequently. And as I mentioned, I work for a company called Bounteous. Back when offices were a thing, we have offices throughout North America. I work primarily within the Drupal practice, get to learn a ton from the great team that I work with. And if you're looking to have great Drupal work done, get in touch. And if you're looking to do great Drupal work, we are often hiring. So we can just dive right in. So in general, from a front-end development perspective, components have really taken over the web. And this general approach of breaking things down into their smaller pieces and building using a system of components rather than, building individual pages is something that doesn't really seem to be going away, which is great because I really enjoy this approach. It was popularized by Brad Frost's atomic design concept. You see the kind of default images there on the right. It's just a specific way to think about breaking things down into smaller parts. But what we're talking about today is web components. And a really common point of confusion there is like web components like, React and Angular and things like that. And those are definitely JavaScript frameworks that are really centered around the concept of components. But specifically, what we're going to be talking about today is web components from the perspective of a set of web platform APIs that are not tied to a specific framework. So these are essentially a browser native way to be able to build components on the web. And there's kind of three main pieces to this API. There's custom elements, the shadow DOM, and HTML templates. And we'll talk about all those as we go along. So personally, I really love this kind of component-based way of thinking about front-end development. And that would make me a prime target to love web components. But why I started trying to put together this talk and thinking about this topic is because I've found that it hasn't found its way into my typical workflow. And that's confusing to me. So I wanted to learn more about web components and hopefully learn why that is and if it should change. So with that, I'm coming at this, hopefully clear from the title of the talk, not as a mega expert. I'm learning, but hopefully, my process of learning and what I've experienced can be useful to people. There are also a handful of people in or tangentially around the Drupal community who are more experienced with web components and are doing really cool things. I would encourage you to follow them on Twitter and see what they're up to. So kind of diving in a little bit more about the specifics of what web components actually are. So the first question you might be asking is, can I use web components today? That for me was my excuse for a while, that browser support was kind of spotty and it wasn't ready for prime time. So a couple screenshots here from Can I Use, which shows that the browser support for it is really good now in modern browsers. And even if you needed to support something like IE11, it can be done with polyfills. You might want to consider, depending on how important your IE11 support is, there's going to be some additional effort, but it's definitely possible. And then, interestingly enough, on top of that, another question to ask is, can I use web components? And so if we look here, if you actually inspect the Can I Use website, you'll see that it's actually built on a set of custom web components. So there's that CIU support table custom element there. And if you expand that, you see that it has a shadow root. And inside of that, there's some markup that's more familiar, but also nested inside of it are other custom elements like that CIU browser support. So it's pretty cool that a site that many of us rely on is really built on top of custom elements like this. It's a great real world example. And there are many others at that wild.open-wc.org site. So from my perspective, trying to learn more about this, as I typically do, I thought I should just go build one. And the first time I was putting together this talk, it was like October, November of last year, trying to figure out what to build. So, what could be a very relevant component that I interacted with a lot in that time of 2020? If there was only something like an election results tracker that I spent hours and hours staring at and refreshing and refreshing. So yeah, I landed on, trying to create a version of the New York Times election results tracker due to the fact that I had been staring at it so frequently, an unhealthy amount even. So this is what I ended up building, kind of the end results. I think it looks pretty close, which is cool. So it's a results tracker custom element, and you can pass in data into it, as we see here, through attributes, and create your own version of the results tracker. It has some nice CSS transitions when the scale changes, and you can pass anything into it too. So we have the Mario versus Luigi election, the election of the century. So fun to build, but let's dig in a little bit to the individual pieces and also how we would use something like this. So let's talk about using the election tracker custom element. So you would have to import this JavaScript as a JS module. So it could be a file that you have locally in your code base. It also could be an NPM dependency. And I've actually published this package, backline int/results tracker, if you want to pull it down and try it out. And then once you've imported it, you can use the custom element in your markup, just like any HTML element, and pass data into it using attributes. And then one thing worth noting is that if your component has external dependencies, you'll probably still need to use a bundler of some kind, like Webpack or Rollup, et cetera. But that even seems to be changing in the JavaScript landscape now. There's a lot more going on in kind of bundleless setups and being able to import, over HTTP. So that might change over time. So let's look at the kind of those three pieces we were talking about, and just starting with the concept of a custom element. So we have this little code pen here that has, stands up just an example of that custom element. And you'll see here, so we have our election results tracker, and then in the HTML markup, so we're just using it. So we've, at the top, imported it as a module, and we're using, in this particular case, unpackage, and that has this question mark module parameter that you can tack on at the end. And that will actually handle importing some of your dependencies magically. So I don't know that's the way that I would set this up in production, but for a CodePen, definitely great. And then here we can just use our results tracker element. I can highlight correctly, just like any other HTML element. And we can pass in attributes, and as we update things, we'll see it's a little funky in a CodePen, but you'll see that the race here is now for President Hay FLDC. And yeah, as we change things here, the component picks up on it and re-renders. And then also for the candidates, it made the most sense to me to handle that as objects. And you'll see that we're basically just passing in here a JSON object, which feels a little funky, but we'll talk a little bit more about the impact of that and how some of these libraries also can handle that a little bit better. And then this paragraph in here is something called a slot. So it's basically just a variable where we can pass in markup. We'll look at some examples of that too. So that's kind of the basics of just using a custom element. Now let's talk about the shadow DOM. So the shadow DOM here, we already saw an example with the Can I Use site. But if you expand one of these custom elements, you'll likely see the shadow root here. So what the shadow DOM is, it's its own local encapsulated DOM tree. It is separate from the typical DOM that you have globally. Yeah, see, it says that. And that means that it's going to prevent things from colliding. And also that things in the traditional DOM can't reach in most cases, to the shadow DOM. So for example, you can't use a query selector to get the subheadline element inside of the shadow DOM. It won't see it. It's also possible to attach styles to the shadow DOM that will be scoped locally. So that also prevents styles from colliding. And it also prevents, in a lot of cases, styles from getting in too, which from my perspective is really kind of a different way to think about styling. And we'll talk a little bit more about the options and the impact there. And also it's super duper spooky, shadow DOM. Nobody's gonna forget that name. Coolest name in the modern web, I say. So yeah, like I promised, we'll talk about, we'll look at some examples here of scope styles. This probably is, in my opinion, the most difficult thing to wrap your head around here. Maybe it's just my perspective because I'm used to styling in a particular way, but I've got a little CodePen that I put together, actually a code sandbox, and we'll jump in and try some things out to show all the interesting quirks of this. So first, I guess I can show the example itself in the results tracker component. So we have a style property where we're defining our scoped style. So all these things are specific to this component. We've also got this host selector, which basically is the custom element itself. And we'll see some more examples of that. But within the custom element, there are still classes that we're targeting, typical BEM classes here. So if we look at this global style sheet, we can see the kind of different impact that the scoping can have. So there's also this div down here below that has a results tracker headline class, same class that is used inside of the shadow DOM for this component. So if I uncomment this here, which is styles that are targeted at that results tracker headline class, we'll see that the instance of that class outside of the shadow DOM changes, but the one inside of it does not, because that class, it can't leak into the shadow DOM. However, there are a number of interesting exceptions here. So one is that inherited properties cascade into the shadow DOM. So if we enable this chunk here, so we're setting Comic Sans on the body, which everyone should do, and turning things red. So these are inherited properties that would cascade down. So we'll see, obviously the thing outside of the shadow DOM has those styles. We'll see that the red is kind of coming through. We don't see our Comic Sans. The reason for that in this case is because if we look at our results tracker, on the host element, the host selector, we're setting the font family, and that overrides the things that are cascading, just like in typical CSS. So if we just commented that out, then we'll see that the Comic Sans also should cascade in. Yeah, the headline also has a font family set, but you'll see for a number of other things, this becomes a much less professional looking version of the New York Times results tracker. So still more to think about here. You can select the custom element itself. So we can select results tracker here and set background color and color on it. Again, the custom element can override it, but it is possible to style just the top level from the outside. You can't target children of the shadow DOM element. So this next chunk here, it's trying to get an H2 inside and set it to Comic Sans, and that doesn't work. So those are the rules as far as things getting in and out of the shadow DOM, but there are also some essentially like styling hooks that allow you to intentionally expose a styling API that gives some more ways for things outside to impact things inside. So another inherited property are CSS custom properties, CSS variables. So those will cascade down. So if we have a default background here, custom variable that's set at the root, and if we use that here in the host element, you'll see here we're using the default background, that pierces the shadow DOM and comes through. And then you can also override that at anywhere within the custom element. So we could target the custom element itself and override it. We could override it inside the custom element. So you can use those variables for things like theming or just general hooks that you can use to affect the styling of a scoped custom element. And then you can also use things like classes. As I'm talking through this, I'm realizing this is almost like a talk's worth of custom element styling tricks, but I think it's really interesting. So we can add a class as well. So I'll add this offset class to the results tracker. And it adds some padding here. And the reason that works is that we have this host selector for the offset class. So if the offset class is added to the custom element, we add that padding. And then last couple things before we move on from styling. So there's also, get that class out of here. The concept of a shadow part. So if I enable this chunk here, so a shadow part is basically a way to define a section of your custom element that can be styled from the outside. So if we look at the markup for the results tracker right here, we have a part defined for the headline, and that's what allows us to target it. So we're basically saying, actually for this headline, we can go ahead and let things outside change it. Again, it's really specific and targeted. You can't get at children. It's literally just that specific part, I guess. And then the other thing is I talked about slots before. So that's basically just a variable where you can pass in markup. in this case anyway, it's the subheadline. And that is actually, what is referred to as the light DOM, or like you can just think of as the traditional DOM. So you can style that just as you would anything else globally. So if I have a style for a paragraph here, it affects the markup in the slot, even though this custom element has a shadow DOM. Whew. So yeah, that's a lot. And this was my first time going through this particular example. I think I would probably move it later in the talk. But there is a lot to the impact of scope styles with this stuff. And I find it quite confusing. But walking through all those examples, here's how I've been trying to kind of make sense of it. So in general, the biggest thing is that only inherited properties can pierce the shadow DOM. Those are the only things that come in. And everything else requires you opening up some sort of styling hook intentionally. So there were all the things we looked at: CSS custom properties, classes, shadow parts, and slots. And then also, in the case of an emergency, there's a number of ways that you could just opt out of that scope styling altogether. You could opt out of the shadow DOM, which takes away some of the potential advantages here, but does make styling more traditional. It seems like you can use slots as a way around this potentially too. So those were a couple of the main pieces. Let's actually look with the time that we have left at some examples of actually building a custom element. So the first one we'll do is just using vanilla JavaScript. So these are the kind of browser native APIs. And we're going to focus specifically on just rendering a headline in this case, just to keep it really simple and specific. So this is an index.html file, and we are using our results tracker element and passing in a headline attribute. And then we're also importing the results tracker script as a module. So in that results tracker JavaScript file, we have a class that extends HTML element. And then inside of a constructor, we're basically building this element from scratch. So we're creating the shadow root, which in general is just something that I'll like copy and paste. Typically, you're going to use that open mode. I find that there is a closed option, but it's not usually used. And then below that, we're basically just creating all of the structure of this component and all the elements that we need: a wrapping div, setting a class on it, adding our H2, and so on. And then kind of adding that all together to create our headline element. And then one of the last things we're doing, or at least the last thing we're doing in the constructor, is attaching that to the shadow DOM. So we have our element and we're appending it to the shadow DOM. And then the last thing here, we are defining our results tracker custom element. So we have the name of the element, results-tracker, and then we're passing in that class. And that's what registers it and allows us to use it in our markup. So I'm definitely, over the years, used to using templating as opposed to that JavaScript approach that we saw there of building the individual elements pieces together. So you can use a HTML template, as we talked about before, instead. So this is that same example refactored to use the template. So we're creating a template element. And so HTML templates are interesting in that they are not by default referenced in the DOM, but you can then reference them using your JavaScript or clone them or duplicate them. So if you just create this, it doesn't really exist anywhere until you attach it to something. So then we have our templates, and the inner HTML just uses the backticks, a tag template literal, where we have our markup, and we can also access variables. So we're getting the headline attribute for our H2. And then same sort of stuff, attaching it to the shadow DOM and defining and registering our custom element. And then there is scoped styling. So we can create a style element here, and then we can set the text content on that style element that is just traditional CSS, also within those tag template literals. And then if we attach that style to the shadow DOM, it is scoped to the shadow DOM. There are definitely some plugins that you can use that can make the syntax highlighting here a lot more pleasant and CSS-like. So that those steps would have built our custom element that has that headline. But one thing that you would notice if you play around with it is that if you change the headline attribute, it doesn't automatically re-render and pick up on those changes. So with this vanilla approach, you have to write some code to handle that as well. So you need to specify the observed attributes property here. And in this case, we're observing the headline attribute. And then there's a number of lifecycle callbacks. And the one that we need to use here is attribute changed callback. So it takes the name of the attribute that you're observing and old and new values. So typically you're going to want to check the old and new value so that you don't do unnecessary re-rendering, make sure that something has actually changed. And then if that has changed, we select the element within the shadow DOM and then change the value of it to the new value. So I'm going to guess that many of you who are following along probably have a similar thought, like that is a lot of work for a headline. And I agree. So wait for it. The next thing we're going to get into is so many libraries. So there are a number of libraries that help are intended to help with that developer experience. Lit element, stencil, fast element, things with funky names like haunted and hybrids, and many, many, many more. But the feeling that I had, starting to turn to these things is, isn't that getting us kind of back to where we started, where we have a number of different JavaScript frameworks that all handle things a little bit differently, and we're getting away from having this kind of browser native standard. So that was kind of my initial feeling, but the only way to really find out for sure is to try using one. So we're going to look at an example of refactoring the selection tracker using lit element. Lit element is a Google project. It does seem to be kind of the most commonly used of these libraries by quite a wide margin. So again, just looking at rendering the headline, the index.html is exactly the same as the vanilla JS version. And then within our results tracker, we have to import lit element and lit HTML. We now have some dependencies, and we're extending lit element in this case. We define our properties, in this case, just the headline, and specify that it's of type string, and then define a render method. So here, because we imported lit HTML, we can use this HTML tag template literal and access variables in there. There's a few other nice tricks that it offers. But you'll also see that we just kind of magically have access to the headline attribute and don't have to query for it here, which is nice. So just those, not a lot of code for that. It does quite a bit with a lot less. So it renders and registers the custom element. We've got templating. It's automatically observing updates to attributes. The only thing that in that example we haven't added yet are scope styles. So we can just take a look at that. So we also have to import CSS from lit element, and then we can have a static styles property, where in another tag template literal, a CSS tag template literal, we can define our styles. And there's a plugin for VS Code for, excuse me, lit element, which does really, really nice syntax highlighting. So that'll give us our scope styles. And then just a couple things about also handling attributes. So I don't think we even covered this in the vanilla example, but for something like the candidates object, where that's being passed in as a JSON object, we have to parse that when it comes in and out to be able to work with it. But lit element has some nice helpers in that if you define the type, so if we define a type of array here or a type of object, it will automatically do that JSON parsing for you, which again is another kind of developer experience nicety. So I won't jump into it, and we did kind of look at it before, but there's a code sandbox that has the lit element example here. And from my perspective, it feels like a more reasonable amount of work for a headline, or especially for like the full results tracker. Then talking about some other libraries, there's Stencil, which is another popular one. It's actually one of the things I tried first when trying to find my way into web components. One way that they describe themselves on their site is a compiler that generates web components. And it kind of extends and builds on top of the capabilities of web components. So it does pre-rendering, handles objects as properties. It has its own virtual DOM. It uses JSX. So at first that seemed cool, but as I kind of worked through this, this definitely, from my personal opinion, goes a little bit too far beyond that concept of having kind of a standard and a browser native version of a component. Taking like lit elements, I would feel pretty confident if like Google vanished somehow, that I could build the same thing using the vanilla JS. But especially for some of the enhancements that Stencil adds, if I had to refactor this to be vanilla, I wouldn't know how to do it, and there'd be a lot of work. So for me, that's a downside, but it also potentially provides a nice developer experience. And then also early on, I looked at Vue, and a number of JavaScript libraries, frameworks, can use web components as a build target now, which sounds great. But working with the Vue example, it still requires the Vue library as a dependency. So you have to load all of Vue to be able to use a web component that Vue builds, which from my perspective seems to defeat the purpose. Like at that point, why not just use Vue? Maybe that'll get better over time. Maybe I'm missing something, not sure. Also, another topic that you might be wondering about is using web components with a JavaScript framework. So, could I create custom elements, for example, that I can use on any project, regardless of what JavaScript framework I'm using? There's a great website, Custom Elements Everywhere, that outlines the support. And in general, it's actually really good and pretty solid across the board. But interestingly enough, React has some noticeable limitations. They have a long-standing issue where they're trying to look at ways to improve it, but for whatever reason, it doesn't seem to be gaining steam you would hope. And we can actually take a quick look at this. We're running a little short on time. So the code sandbox is out there if you want to poke around a little bit more, but just to kind of get into what some of those limitations are. So here we have a React app that is actually just rendering two web components, the results tracker, and then also this toggle, which is from a library called generic components, which just offers a bunch of generic web component primitives. And so let's say that we want to have state, in this case, that the React application controls, but these web components also use. So we're defining essentially just a politics and a non-politics version of all this data. And we can use this switch to toggle between them. So, we're kind of defining our state in this React app in a pretty traditional way. We can actually just use our results tracker custom element right in our JSX, which is cool. But where it gets a little bit difficult and funky here, so we do have to convert the candidate's object into a JSON string like we saw before. We can't just access that variable. It might be possible, it's something I need to play around with. It might be possible to actually set that on the attribute itself in JavaScript. Yeah, this is the way I've done it so far. But the more kind of challenging thing is for the switch, where we want it to be able to, we want this app to be able to react to changes that happen in our switch web component. We kind of have to jump through some hoops there. So the examples that I saw with React use the concept of a higher order component that essentially wrap the web component. So we have our generic switch here, excuse me. But we have to have, first of all, this use effect hook to determine when there is a event for the value of the toggle being checked changes. And we do that with a ref here, which is a way to reference something in the traditional DOM outside of React's virtual DOM. So we're basically looking into the DOM here to listen for that event. And then when that event happens, we pass that down into the component. So I sped through that pretty quickly. So it probably doesn't give you the whole picture, but basically there is a lot that you have to do still in the React side to be able to play nice with a web component now. Other frameworks do it a lot better, but it would be great if you could just use this element in React and it's a little bit more intertwined with the framework. So just a few more minutes, and want to make sure that also we have a couple minutes for questions. And I think Amy June is probably going to yell at me for a 5-minute warning soon. So working with components in frameworks definitely made me think about how one would approach managing application state with web components. And there really didn't seem to be an obvious pattern there. So you basically can do whatever you want in JavaScript. You could roll your own way to manage state. You could use any state JavaScript-based state management library like Redux, for example. Although it feels like it would be nice if there was some general standard of how you would approach this with web components. But at the same time, maybe this isn't a reasonable expectation. Maybe the real value of these web components here are, using them as kind of primitive components and having the state managed outside of them. I'm not sure, but this still feels like a gap to me. So, now that I've kind of been able to walk through a few examples, I feel like I have slightly more educated views on web components, and it was hard to learn, which is potentially an issue. And as far as like what I would look to use it for now is definitely a case where a kind of single purpose, special purpose component that you might want to use in a bunch of different contexts. Something like this election tracker, that seems like a pretty great case for this. I'm not yet at the point where I would be comfortable using this for a full app or an entire design system. It's probably just lack of experience, but I don't feel like I'm there yet. And as far as how I'd approach it, I wouldn't personally use vanilla JavaScript. I would use a library, probably a lit element, because I'd want one that still feels pretty close to the vanilla API. Also something to touch on just really quickly, there could potentially be a talk about this in and of itself, but a recent use case that I ran into for my company's website, we've slowly been introducing decoupled and statically built pieces of content on the site. But we're in a case where we're using some of the Drupal markup in those pages to generate those pages. So we've got like our overall Gatsby page, but Drupal markup inside of it. that we're getting from the API. And we ran into some challenges here trying to get Drupal styles to come along with this component without causing all kinds of styling regressions within the React application. And this is actually a case where if that Drupal markup was using a custom element that had its own scope styles, it would have just worked. It would have all the things. There aren't going to be any of those conflicts. So it's a pretty interesting use case for this. The kind of gap from my perspective is, how would I see this coming? How would I be able to prepare for this need? And it seems like the only way is to just be building in web components, but anticipating this situation, it seems like kind of the hard part still.
So I am going to give the 5-minute warning, but next is lunch. So if Q&A runs over, I don't think that's a big deal this time.
Cool. Yeah, I'm just about done anyway as well. I would hate to make you mad, Amy June. Yeah, so just wrapping up as far as like my view on web components overall, I think on an infinite timescale, this concept is going to win out, some sort of browser native approach to building components. But I still don't really have a good feeling for how long that is going to take. I do feel like there has been a lot of steam gaining around web components over the past year or so. But I'm also not as confident that it will be this particular take on web components. There are still a whole lot of interesting quirks to this. So maybe it's some evolved version of this, not sure. But at least I got to build that election tracker, which was really fun. So yeah, we'll have some time for questions. The other thing I definitely like to plug is the contribution day. Great way to contribute back to the project. Last year in person, I participated and kind of got introduced to the Olivero theme and chipped in on that, and it was a lot of fun. So hope to see everybody there. But yeah, if anybody has questions, I would love to answer them.
And feel free to either put them in chat or just hop on with Zoom.
Yep, I see a few in, maybe one or two in the chat. So Benji said, one use case is where you have different frameworks that have to share brand identity. Yeah, that is definitely a good use case. Any other questions? Are people's brains melted? Has anybody been working with web components already? I'd be interested in that.
Actually, so I've got a question. Why would you want to decouple it from the architecture? Like you talked about how React, you'd have to, or with the Vue one, and I'm not saying either one's good or bad, but why would you want to decouple it from Vue or React or wherever you're building the web component in?
I don't know that I want to.
Right.
You definitely have to.
Like, why would you do that? So.
Yeah, so for React, you have to do that because React doesn't support web components very well. For things like Vue, my understanding is a little bit better. I just haven't gotten around to trying it out in Vue. So it might be a little bit of a different answer there. But I just don't know.
Oh, thank you.
Cool. Any challenges with Drupal blocks and whatnot? So that's a great question. So there actually there is a relatively new module called the component module, not the components module, that is kind of a successor to the progressively decoupled blocks module, if anybody has used that. But that module really is specifically focused around making it easy to integrate JavaScript components into Drupal. You can define your component in a YAML file and even define fields that will be like created to a custom block. And there are examples in that code base specifically using web components. It takes in basically the fields on that custom block get passed in as attributes in wrapping markup. So definitely one to check out for an example. So there's a lot of different ways to do it, and that module actually makes it pretty easy. Any other questions? Hopefully this was helpful and interesting. Also just nice to feel like I'm not alone in my basement these days, so I'll take that.
Yeah, I just wanted to share my experience with web components. I created a menu and header for AAA that they could use on multiple sites without having the styling from the site that it was on affect the header. And you know, it had drop. The nice thing about it was we were able to use drop-down menus, which wouldn't have been possible if we used an iframe header. So yeah, being able to embed web components from one site onto another site is one of the advantages.
Awesome. How did you handle the data for that, like the menu in that case?
It was hosted on one of their sites, and the web component just pulled in the data from that site.
Gotcha. Cool. Another question: best principles for documenting web components and reduce technical debt. I don't really have a ton of experience in that particular area, although there is, I think it's with the lit element project. There's a specific kind of JS doc standard that you can follow. And that also has the ability to be used to, there's a project that I forget exactly what it allows you to do. I think it allows you to like generate web components from documentation, but there are some examples. I'll try to dig that up and follow up with it on Twitter. But haven't done a ton with it aside from, you know, just typical documentation. Cool. Yeah, I know we're getting to lunch and I don't see any other questions. Always happy to talk about this or any other things. So feel free to find me in GatherTown or ping me on Slack or whatever. And this is fun. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks again, Brian, as always.
Thanks.